So those are some shots of your university, and I hope they bring back some happy memories of your time here. Now, the main reason for making this video is to record your graduation. Today, you join the graduates of the university, and at the moment, those are about 80,000 in all. Moreover, they come from all countries, and they're now spread in all corners of the world. So this is a university, not just a university of the United Kingdom, but a university that is recognized worldwide. It is a large university and an important one, and in graduating from it, you've done well. We, of course, like all other universities in the United Kingdom, are at the moment under some pressure. Society is wishing its universities to change, and the University of Manchester is no exception. So continuously, we have to move forward to adapt to what is required and to abandon what is no longer required. We believe we're doing that. But there are one or two things that remain constant and can't be changed. We, when we educate our students from this university, are very keen that they should be able to do various important things. They should be able to marshal fact, develop argument, and above all, I think, have a regard for the truth. And we hope we've done that as far as you're concerned. But enough of all that. Now on to the video of the graduation itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this ceremony for the conferment of degrees. The degrees that will be awarded today are the culmination of many years of hard work and are the recognition of high academic achievement on the part of the graduates. And each of you waiting to be admitted to your degree can be justly proud of what you have achieved. But I'm sure you would recognise, as your teachers recognise, the importance of the support and the encouragement that you have received from your family and friends. And that's why the university values these congregations so much. Today, we have an opportunity to share with your parents and grandparents, husbands or wives, our common pride in your success, and to join with them in offering you our warmest congratulations. And for me, there is a particular pleasure in presiding at this ceremony because many of the graduates who will be admitted to degrees today are students who I myself have taught. For most of you, today's ceremony formally ends the period in which you have been students. From now on, You will be applying what you have learnt, or you will be exercising your minds in modes of thought developed while you were learning. The great value of higher education is the training that it provides by the discipline of studying a subject in depth or in breadth, coupled with the need to be analytical and critical of the received wisdom. These days, there's developing a rather distressing tendency to classify courses into vocational and non-vocational, with the implied view that the first is good and the second is bad. But both have their place, because both can provide that rigorous training which is the characteristic of higher education. The distinction between vocational and non-vocational is in many ways a false one. The important thing is to have learned how to learn and how to combine imagination with rigour. And this capacity to combine an open mind with a facility for constructive criticism will be even more important in the future. For most of you, today's ceremony will not mark the end of your process of learning. Some of you will go on to study for further formal qualifications. But even if this is not your way forward, the pace of change in society is so rapid that you will need to learn and relearn many things in the course of your careers. Continuing education and professional retraining will be crucial aspects of your personal and professional development in the years ahead. Today, you become members of 2 international fellowships. You become a graduate of this great university with its high reputation and its historic traditions. And in becoming a graduate, you will be linked by ties of sentiment and history to those graduates who have preceded you and those who will follow. And we very much hope that you will maintain those ties by your membership of the convocation of the university. And in addition, you will become a member of that fellowship that consists of scholars in your own subject or profession, a fellowship in which the subject is more important than the nationality of those forming the fellowship. This university prides itself on the fact that it is a full-service university of international repute. Today, we can see something of what that means. Sitting before me, we have graduates from the Faculty of Economic and Social Studies. Now, whether you have specialised in accounting or economics, or government or sociology, or any of the other subjects or combinations of subjects that can be taken within the faculty, you will have been taught by distinguished scholars. Men and women whose reputation and standing are widely acknowledged and modestly borne. But even so, this faculty is just one part of the university. A university that contains, amongst others, large faculties of science, medicine, and arts. And this breadth and the expertise which supports it are the very essence of what a university stands for. But in addition to its determination to maintain its reputation for teaching and research across the full spectrum of academic disciplines, the university is aware of and tries to respond to its responsibilities to the local community and to the nation as a whole. Through further education and training, industrial liaison, research consultancy and public service, we hope to contribute something to improving the society in which we all live. And the country, indeed the world at large, is faced with major challenges, problems of inequality, social injustice, of technological change, competing ideologies, and of economic uncertainty. It's our hope that through the education that you have received here, not only will you have achieved personal fulfillment, but that you will find yourselves better able to make a contribution to the solution of some of these problems. Bear this in mind as we all offer you our warmest congratulations and our best wishes for your future happiness and success.
Mr. Pro-Vice-Chancellor, on behalf of the Senate of the University, I present to you for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, John Philip Martin.
By the authority vested in me, I admit you to the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. Well done.
Rebecca Louise Smelly.
I admit you.
Gareth Mark Winrow.
I admit you.
And for the degree of Master of Arts in Economic and Social Studies, Sandra Mary Billsborough.
By the authority vested in me, I admit you to the degree of Master of Arts in Economic and Social Studies.
Thank you.
Anne Bousfield.
I admit you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Dorothy Ann Clinch.
I admit you.
Laurie Stephen Clow.
I admit you.
John Anthony Flynn.
I admit you.
Graham John Holt.
I admit you.
William Arthur Ingram.
I admit you.
Thank you very much.
Tracy Ann Kirkwood.
I admit you.
Joseph Long.
I admit you.
Eileen Marie Moore.
I admit you.
David Morland.
I admit you.
Hugh Morley.
I admit you.
Ian Murphy.
I admit you.
Nicholas Brendan Neary.
I admit you.
Jonathan Bramhill Pearson.
I admit you.
Barry Southern.
I admit you.
And for the degree of Bachelor of Arts in Economic and Social Studies with honours, Andrew Robert Albon.
I admit you to the degree of Bachelor of Arts in Economic and Social Studies. Well done.
Timothy Nicholas Ash.
I admit you.
Stephen Philip Day.
I admit you.
Simon Robert Eagles.
I admit you.
Catherine Olwen Farr.
I admit you.
Adrian Farthing.
I admit you.
Morris Harold Helfgott.
I admit you.
Thank you.
Chester Hung Tim Ho.
I admit you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Teng Chuan Koo.
I admit you.
Carl Richard William Livingstone.
I admit you.
Ruth Phillips.
I admit you.
Thank you.
Julian Charles Ravel.
I admit you.
Thanks.
Daniel Salkin.
I admit you.
Fiona Louise Smith.
I admit you.
Thanks.
James Stephen Thornton.
I admit you.
Stephen Paul Wolfe.
I admit you.
Harvey Burtonshaw Ainley.
I admit you.
Jonathan Mark Ashworth.
I admit you.
Paul Atkinson.
I admit you.
Kim Jacqueline Byala Barrington.
I admit you.
Peter Joseph Bevan.
I admit you.
Teresa Martina Bogan.
I admit you.
Peter Colin Bowyer.
I admit you.
Emma Constance Brierley.
I admit you.
Nicholas George Bron.
I admit you.
Heather Claire Burston.
I admit you.
Karen Linda Burton.
I admit you.
Aaron Paul Kaplan.
I admit you.
Vicky Chung Se Chan.
I admit you.
Peter Joel Charles.
I admit you.
Simon Nicholas Chester.
I admit you.
Grant Stacey Clark.
I admit you.
Stephen Ronald Cooper.
I admit you.
David Benedict Crossan.
I admit you.
Philip Gareth Davis.
I admit you.
Linda Jane Desforges.
I admit you.
John Michael Dixon.
I admit you.
Richard Mark Dixon.
I admit you.
Abigail Eve Donald.
I admit you.
Richard Patrick Dorset.
I admit you.
Claire Elizabeth Eaton.
I admit you.
Anne Elizabeth Fatkin.
I admit you.
Trevor Paul Fleer.
I admit you.
Thank you very much.
Jill Catherine Foster.
I admit you.
Simon Gray.
I admit you.
Andrew David Griffith.
I admit you.
Simon Matthew Gwinnett.
I admit you.
Maria Hallows.
I admit you.
Geoffrey William Hobbs.
I admit you.
Eunice Jones.
I admit you.
Linda Christine Jones.
I admit you.
Adam Simon Catton.
I admit you.
Anne Kelly.
I admit you.
Graham Ewan Kelly.
I admit you.
Mark Kilgore.
I admit you.
Mark Kissack.
I admit you.
Jonathan Stewart Kitzberg.
I admit you.
David Allen Knights.
I admit you.
Alistair John Leonard.
I admit you.
Christopher David Lodge.
I admit you.
Nigel Raymond Lowe.
I admit you.
Charles Stewart Lucas.
I admit you.
Sean K. Mack.
I admit you.
Benjamin Duncan Matthews.
I admit you.
Mary Louise McAvoy.
I admit you.
Peter David McCann.
I admit you.
Helen Jane McDowell.
I admit you.
James McNamara.
I admit you.
Edward Simon Middleton.
I admit you.
Hiran Shirish Modi.
I admit you.
Toby Moss.
I admit you.
Edward Vincent New.
I admit you.
Richard Jonathan Newton.
I admit you.
Sammy Ngugi Ngera.
I admit you.
Peter Guy Nottingham.
I admit you.
David Anthony Percy.
I admit you.
Mark Roderick Robson.
I admit you.
Helena Waymun Sek.
I admit you.
Stephen Neil Seifert.
I admit you.
Deborah Judith Sherwood.
I admit you.
Ian Robert Shields.
I admit you.
James Henry Skipper.
I admit you.
Carol Ann Smith.
I admit you.
Gary John Smith.
I admit you.
Michael Richard Smith.
I admit you.
Andrew John Stanbury.
I admit you.
Jonathan Ashley Steinberg.
I admit you.
Janice Mary Stelfox.
I admit you.
Jane Ann Stickler.
I admit you.
Robert Andrew Inglis Sweet.
I admit you.
Peter John Tarimo.
I admit you.
James David Tarrant.
I admit you.
Fiona Catherine Tudge.
I admit you.
Martin James Turner.
I admit you.
Howard Roderick Walker.
I admit you.
Thank you.
Catherine Walsh.
I admit you.
Giles Richard Ward.
I admit you.
Thank you.
Graham Paul Webster.
I admit you.
Thanks very much.
Caroline Ann Williams.
I admit you.
Rebecca Catherine Williams.
I admit you.
Elaine Maxine Wober.
I admit you.
Simon Peter Wood.
I admit you.
John Kenneth William Woodford.
I admit you.
Mark David Abrahams.
I admit you.
Paul Daniel Adams.
I admit you.
Stephen James Adams.
I admit you.
Christopher David Allen.
I admit you.
Mark Peter Allen.
I admit you.
Alan Michael Baxter.
I admit you.
Jane Louise Benton.
I admit you.
Jonathan Stephen Bubia.
I admit you.
Andrew Jonathan Brooks.
I admit you.
Michelle Bruff.
I admit you.
Monica Anna Brzezinska.
I admit you.
Carl John Berlin.
I admit you.
Flora Faith Butterwick.
I admit you.
Gavin Stephen Grant Carlo.
I admit you.
Gail Cooper Chambers.
I admit you.
Sao Lin Irene Chan.
I admit you.
Julia Janine Chard.
I admit you.
John Chilton.
I admit you.
Epi Oi Kwan Choi.
I admit you.
Timothy James Clay.
I admit you.
Stuart Johnson Cole.
I admit you.
David James Conda.
I admit you.
Robert Conroy.
I admit you.
Neil Jeremy Corney.
I admit you.
Jonathan Craven.
I admit you.
Simon John de Troisy.
I admit you.
Marina Fiona Deville.
I admit you.
Naomi Ilke Dorman.
I admit you.
Anthony John Dowling.
I admit you.
Mohammed Zunaid Dadhaya.
I admit you.
Peter Stephen Edwards.
I admit you.
Graham Stewart Garbett.
I admit you.
Miriam Rachel Gelberg.
I admit you.
Rachel Kim Goldie.
I admit you.
Ian Peter Gordon.
I admit you.
Madeleine Gumpert.
I admit you.
Simon Michael Hancocks.
I admit you.
Alexander Harouni.
I admit you.
Jason Douglas Hiley.
I admit you.
Christian Holgate.
I admit you.
James Paul Hollyman.
I admit you.
David Hon.
I admit you.
Catherine Wynne Hughes.
I admit you.
Tony Ann James.
I admit you.
Carrie O'Neill Johnston.
I admit you.
Mark Jeffrey Kelly.
I admit you.
David Andrew Knight.
I admit you.
Bipin Ladd.
I admit you.
Wing Shu Lisa Lee.
I admit you.
Ying Chai Lee.
I admit you.
Eugene Lee.
I admit you.
Nicola Therese Loft.
I admit you.
Philip James Lord.
I admit you.
David Ronald Marshall.
I admit you.
Stuart McDonough.
I admit you.
Jane Deborah Miller.
I admit you.
Gustavo Monge Camina.
I admit you.
Eugene Patrick Murphy.
I admit you.
Luella Eng.
I admit you.
Kevin Fitzclarence Dominic O'Connell.
I admit you.
Omobola Oyewole.
I admit you.
Elaine Avril Pickering.
I admit you.
Sergi Poloni.
I admit you.
Wing Leung Poon.
I admit you.
Claire Nicola Preston.
I admit you.
Adam Girth Regis.
I admit you.
Andrew Craig Reynolds.
I admit you.
Melanie Elizabeth Richards.
I admit you.
Samantha Mary Roberts.
I admit you.
Ian David Robbins.
I admit you.
Kenneth Michael Robinson.
I admit you.
Anne Russell.
I admit you.
John Singh Sangha.
I admit you.
Christina Saul.
I admit you.
I'm really just
Niall Lutley Sclater.
I admit you. Well done.
Howard Benson Siegel.
I admit you.
Jeremy Peter Sylvester.
I admit you.
James Andrew Victor Skelsey.
I admit you.
Elizabeth Victoria Lindley Smith.
I admit you.
Andrew Mark Stanford.
I admit you.
Marie Ann Stanley.
I admit you.
Leo Max Joseph Stern.
I admit you.
Anthony David Stott.
I admit you.
Richard Ian Stroud.
I admit you.
Stephen J. Sullivan.
I admit you.
Y. Chi Tam.
I admit you.
Winnie Yeman Tang.
I admit you.
Richard James Tolley.
I admit you.
Nigel Vasey. Anurada Verma.
I admit you.
Melanie Vinn.
I admit you.
Perry James Walters.
I admit you.
Andrew Vincent Warburton.
I admit you.
Jason Nicholas West.
I admit you.
Roger Charles Widowson.
I admit you.
Mark Wilson.
I admit you.
Karen Paula Woods.
I admit you.
Hon Ning Yang.
I admit you.
Hoi Q Toby Yuen.
I admit you.
Adrian Devine.
I admit you.
Gordon Thomas Fairbrother.
I admit you.
James Robert Hawhey.
I admit you.
Hon Ching Hui Chung Cheong.
I admit you.
Caroline Elizabeth Ingram.
I admit you.
Sean Jeremy Martin.
I admit you.
Adrian Kevin McDermott.
I admit you.
Mohammed Amin Musbali.
I admit you.
Mohammed Yakuth Nalim.
I admit you.
Rosina Ann Robson.
I admit you.
Helen Rachel Shearman.
I admit you.
Elliot Scott Skinner.
I admit you.
Yuet Yung Tang.
I admit you.
Florence Chuk Mun Wong.
I admit you.
Timothy Mark Wren.
I admit you.
And for the degree of Bachelor of Arts in Economic and Social Studies, Robert Orton Willis.
I admit you.
Paul Anthony Bell.
I admit you.
Christopher David Blundell.
I admit you.
Maywan Karen Chim.
I admit you.
Matthew James Brian Davis.
I admit you.
Samantha Haley Jones.
I admit you.
Michael Philip O'Toole.
I admit you.
Anastasia Orphanou.
I admit you.
Ian James Riley.
I admit you.
Anne Louise Stadden.
I admit you.
Michael Francis Patrick Surrey.
I admit you.
And for the degree of Bachelor of Social Science in Social Administration with honours, Ian Peter Forthrop.
By the authority vested in me, I admit you to the degree of Bachelor of Social Science.
Sharon Elizabeth Grace.
I admit you.
Nadia Mindy Peters.
I admit you.
Helen Ruth Pode.
I admit you.
Brendan Gerard Stenson.
I admit you.
Rebecca Mary Charlton.
I admit you.
Peter Andrew Doyle.
I admit you.
Shuk Man Fung.
I admit you.
Amanda Jane Rowick.
I admit you.
Sheila Mary Howe.
I admit you.
Thank you.
And for the degree of Bachelor of Social Science in Social Anthropology with honours, Juliet Rachel Dresser.
I admit you.
Julian Alexander Craig Norris.
I admit you.
David John Ralph Pitchford.
I admit you.
Simon Frederick Stephen Early.
I admit you.
Sally Amanda Jones.
I admit you.
Foloana Kwabela.
I admit you.
And for the degree of Bachelor of Social Science in Sociology with honours, Timothy Costello.
I admit you.
Catherine Francis Breen.
I admit you. Well done.
Anna Lomas.
I admit you.
Michael Stewart Taylor.
I admit you.
Thank you very much.
Michael Anthony Sparks.
I admit you. They always say to keep the best to the last. Well done. Salvasit Universitas Nostra Mancuniensis hoc precantes consagamus.
So now you're leaving the university and going out to start a career in the world. We here in the university wish you the very best of luck. We're sure you'll do very well. When you graduate, as you've just done, you join a body of university graduates called Convocation. This body serves two purposes. First of all, it allows us to keep in touch with you, and we do this by the publication from time to time of a magazine, which we call Manchester Graduate. It'll tell you what's happening in the university, what's new, what's going on, how we're changing, how we're keeping up with the times. But we also want you, through Convocation, or indeed by contact with your old professors and tutors, to let us know what you're doing, how you're getting on in the world, what your experiences have been. This is very interesting to us. Please don't neglect to do it. So now, the world awaits you. Good luck.